Everything for me, and nothing for you, laughed the husband with his mistress during the divorce hearing. But his wife surprised everyone, including herself. Snow swirled over the city, settling on rooftops and sidewalks that the ubiquitous street sweepers hadn't yet cleared. Melissa shivered, pulling her latte-colored coat tighter around her and quickened her pace. I should have left earlier, but I got held up at the clinic. Then again, you're an anesthesiologist, you can't just leave an operation, she thought wistfully. Today was the hearing for the divorce she'd feared and, at the same time, longed for over the past few months. Edward was waiting for her in the courthouse along with his mother, Marie Thompson, and his mistress, Evelyn. Melissa's boots tapped against the snow-dusted sidewalk in a rhythm that matched her nervous heartbeat. At the corner, a hunched-over homeless man, appearing to be in his 30s or so, sat on the ground. His frost-reddened face revealed unmistakable pain. Melissa rummaged through her bag, pulling out a few bills, and placed them in the man's hat. "Here, please take this," she said. The man nodded, accepting the money with trembling hands, and, burying his face in his grimy gloves, mumbled faintly, "Thank you, kind soul. May good fortune follow you today." "And thank you. I could certainly use some luck," she replied. As she walked away, Melissa couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. She was about to engage in a fierce battle over marital property, while this unfortunate man had nothing but the clothes on his back. Ahead, the courthouse came into view, a drab, gray building that looked particularly unwelcoming today. Melissa took a deep breath, trying to calm her trembling nerves. She brushed away a tear, handed her coat to the cloakroom attendant, and opened the door. Courtroom 3 was unexpectedly crowded. In the front row, practically holding hands, sat Edward, his mother, and his latest fling. As always, Edward looked immaculate in an expensive suit with perfectly styled hair. Even in this situation, he exuded the air of a winner. Marie, with her perpetually disapproving expression, gave her daughter-in-law a fleetingly sorrowful glance. She had never truly considered Melissa her enemy and had only attended the hearing at Edward's request rather than of her own accord. Edward's reasoning was simple: with his mother's law degree, her assistance today would be an advantage. Melissa, striving to maintain her composure, took a seat on the opposite side. She had no desire for this trio to see her anxiety and wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. She pulled a notebook from her bag, pretending to review notes, and suddenly felt Edward's piercing gaze on her. Looking up, she caught the smug smirk on his face. "Well, Melissa," he sneered, "I get the cream, and you're left with the scraps. The clinic will be mine anyway." His remark hit a nerve. Ignoring him, she turned toward the window, anxiously awaiting the proceedings to begin. A few minutes later, the judge entered the room, a middle-aged man with a solemn expression and tired eyes. Taking his seat, he cleared his throat and announced the start of the hearing. "Well then," said the judge, glancing through the papers in front of him, "this is a case concerning the dissolution of marriage between Edward Thompson." The judge looked up at Edward briefly before continuing, "and Melissa Stanley." Edward's attorney spoke first. His speech was detached and formal, as if he were reading a traffic accident report. He stated that the marriage had run its course, that the spouses no longer understood each other, and that divorce was the only appropriate solution. Every word felt like a sharp blow to Melissa. She clenched her fists, determined to hold herself together. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up without an attorney. She had decided to represent herself. Melissa spoke about how the clinic was primarily her creation, a product of sleepless nights and years of hard work. She acknowledged that the business had been built together, but made it clear that her contribution was no less significant than Edward's. Edward responded with nothing but a disdainful smirk. "Don't be so dramatic, Melissa," he said, putting an arm around his mistress's shoulders. "You know I've always done the real work. You're just a cog in my system." Melissa barely restrained herself from saying what she really thought of him. "Yes, Edward, you're absolutely right," Evelyn interjected with a sly smile. "You've always been the mastermind. That means the clinic is yours, and only yours. At most, Your ex-wife can expect 20%. Melissa's cheeks burned red with humiliation. The mistress's words, dripping with cynicism, cut deep. She hadn't anticipated that the split would become so vile and treacherous. Evelyn laughed audaciously. Know your place, Melissa, she sneered. Be grateful if you even get anything. In that moment, Melissa realized they didn't just want to take everything from her, they wanted to crush her entirely. The judge, after listening to both sides, gave them an exhausted look. Very well, he said. Considering all circumstances and for a more thorough review of the documents, I'm adjourning this hearing for a week. The courtroom fell silent. Melissa was stunned. She had expected everything to conclude today. Clearly, fate had other plans. Edward and Evelyn exchanged irritated glances. Well, fine, Edward said, standing up. Now we have a whole week to prepare for our triumph. He took Evelyn's arm and strode out of the courtroom. Marie, after giving Melissa the look of pity, followed her son. Melissa was among the last to leave. She couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She had merely been granted a temporary reprieve before the impending battle. How naive she had been to think she could defend herself without professional help. Shaking her head, Melissa walked out of the courthouse, leaving behind its cold, unfriendly walls. The falling snow no longer seemed icy and harsh as it had half an hour earlier. They say there's no such thing as bad weather, she thought, smiling as a snowflake landed softly on her eyelashes. The homeless man on the street corner was gone. He had likely sought warmth in a basement or the stairwell of an apartment building. The snow crunched pleasantly beneath her boots, reminiscent of childhood mornings walking to school, the wind biting at her scarf-covered cheeks. It had been so long ago, and yet it felt like just yesterday. Suddenly, Melissa's phone vibrated in the pocket of her coat. She pulled it out without glancing at the screen. Yes, I'm listening. Melissa Stanley? This is Susan, the receptionist nurse. We have an urgent case, Jeffrey Ford, a businessman. He's being rushed to the ICU and needs immediate surgery. Everyone is waiting for the anesthesiologist. Please come as quickly as you can, the nurse blurted out hastily. Melissa nodded, even though Susan couldn't see her. She firmly replied, I'll be there in 10 minutes. The divorce, personal grievances, and emotional wounds, all of it faded instantly. Her professional duty took precedence. Someone needed her expertise urgently. Melissa flagged down a taxi, gave the clinic's address, and climbed inside. As the car weaved through traffic, she gazed out at the familiar streets with mixed emotions. The clinic, once a testament to her and Edward's shared dreams, was now a bitter reminder of his betrayal. When she arrived, Melissa strode purposefully through the doors, shedding her coat and heading straight for the operating room. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with tense anticipation. Nurses were swiftly arranging instruments, and the surgeons were wrapping up their preparations. Melissa, finally, exclaimed Dr. Raymond Burton, adjusting his mask. I'll be blunt, the patient's in critical condition. 35 years old, and we can't afford any delays. From what I hear, he's been treated by quack doctors before this, but that's irrelevant now. He's prepped and on the table, ready for anesthesia. Please hurry. Melissa nodded and approached the patient. She checked the monitors and equipment with practiced precision. Her eyes drifted to the patient's face, and a chill ran down her spine. She froze. It was him, the homeless man she had helped earlier that morning. There was no mistaking it. The same strong chin, albeit marred by a bump. What's wrong, Melissa? Are you feeling okay? Raymond asked, noticing her hesitation. I'm fine, she replied, steadying herself. Just a bit tired. The court hearing was challenging. Shaking off the shock, Melissa refocused on the task at hand. She inserted the catheter, connected the monitors, and began administering the medications. The patient's heartbeat was faint, his blood pressure dangerously low. Raymond, be ready, she instructed, her voice calm and commanding. Starting anesthesia. The operating room fell silent, save for the faint beeping of monitors and the soft clatter of instruments. Hours passed, each moment stretching endlessly. Finally, Raymond let out a relieved sigh. "Well, that's it. We'll stabilize him and transfer him to the ICU," said Raymond, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Good," Melissa replied, feeling the tension gradually dissipate. "I'll handle the paperwork. After all, until the divorce is finalized, I'm still officially the acting head of this clinic." Raymond coughed politely, choosing not to comment on the awkward subject. The patient was soon moved to the ICU, where the medical team would closely monitor his condition. Melissa left the operating room, utterly drained. But one question lingered in her mind like an intrusive melody. What was that? How could a homeless man from the street suddenly turn out to be a prominent businessman, and her patient, no less? She collapsed into a chair in the doctor's lounge, closing her eyes in exhaustion. It all felt like some bizarre dream. The rest of her shift passed in anxious anticipation. For an anesthesiologist, calculating the exact dose of anesthesia was critical, ensuring the patient could emerge from the medically induced coma without complications. Most of Melissa's cases were seamless. Surgeons valued her expertise and precision, which nearly guaranteed a successful operation. But this patient was different. He stubbornly refused to regain consciousness. A man so young and seemingly robust, why wouldn't he wake up? Could complications have arisen post-surgery? As evening approached, Melissa found herself unable to sit still. Her unease compelled her to stay overnight at the clinic, a decision she rarely made outside of her assigned shifts. Nights like these had once been the bane of her marriage. While she carried the weight of night duties, Edward had taken the opportunity to indulge in affairs free from scrutiny. It was all too convenient for him. For years, Melissa had tirelessly built the clinic's reputation, while her husband pursued his selfish ambitions and pleasures. Where was the justice in that? To the outside world, Edward and Melissa Thompson were a paragon of honesty and respectability. But only a few knew the unflattering truth. In recent years, Edward had completely offloaded the clinic's management onto Melissa under the guise of focusing on other business ventures. He had no medical qualifications, having barely scraped through an economics degree thanks to generous financial backing from his parents. The clinic, once called Renaissance, had a different owner in the past, a man who went bankrupt in the chaos of the 1990s. By then, Melissa was already working at the First Clinical Hospital, where she had earned high regard from her superiors. To buy the clinic, Melissa's father had sold their countryside home near a nature reserve. Edward's parents, who had immigrated, contributed some funds, but their share barely amounted to half of what Melissa's family provided. In the beginning, Edward idolized Melissa and her family for giving him the opportunity to start his own business. But once the clinic flourished, Edward's gratitude faded, replaced by an inflated sense of self-importance. He convinced himself that he alone was responsible for its success. At first, Melissa ignored the signs. By the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. Edward had taken control of the clinic's finances, effectively reducing her to the role of a subordinate. And now Evelyn had entered the picture. Melissa had crossed paths with her once before, indirectly. Evelyn had come to the clinic seeking to terminate a pregnancy. As acting head of the clinic, Melissa had responded politely but firmly. "Apologies, but we do not offer such services." "How can you not offer that? Every private clinic specializes in this. What makes you better?" Or worse, the beauty flared up indignantly. But persuading Melissa was impossible. She loved children, and being deprived of the joys of motherhood herself, she had consciously decided against offering such services at her clinic. Later, Evelyn gave birth to a baby boy, ironically, in the same clinic via a C-section. Of course, Melissa had no way of knowing that the woman she once refused was her husband's mistress. To make matters worse, it was revealed not long after that Edward was named as the child's father. The memory of Edward's joyous laughter still echoed painfully in Melissa's mind. That's how life worked sometimes. Today, Headstrong beauties like Evelyn contemplate termination, and tomorrow they pose as doting mothers. Melissa, however, held no illusions. Rumors about how Evelyn cared for her son had reached her ears. Evelyn had hired a nanny, installed a bunch of high-tech gadgets to monitor the child, and spent her days enjoying lunches with friends in trendy restaurants. Why not? She could afford it. Edward, after all, didn't lack money, and the clinic was considered the best in the region, attracting patients from far and wide. All thanks to Melissa, who had personally interviewed every doctor, nurse, and even janitor before hiring them. She explained her vision and offered excellent working conditions. But Edward never looked beyond his own nose, seeing himself as the founder of not just the clinic but their entire business empire. They could have divorced peacefully, like reasonable adults. But no, Edward had to make a spectacle out of it. He wanted to humiliate Melissa in court, despite knowing full well she deserved at least half of their jointly acquired assets. Her gloomy thoughts were interrupted by the familiar buzz of her phone in the pocket of her lab coat. It was the nurse again. "Melissa, I'm sorry to bother you," Susan said, "but Jeffrey has regained consciousness and wants to speak with you." Melissa felt a twinge of discomfort, but understood she couldn't refuse this patient for reasons she couldn't quite explain. Gathering her remaining strength, she rose and headed toward the ICU. Jeffrey lay on the bed, hooked up to various machines. His face was still pale, but his eyes shone with a keen interest as he looked at her. "Hello," the businessman said weakly. "Hello, Jeffrey," Melissa replied, striving to maintain a professional calm. "How are you feeling?" "Better, I think." "Thank you," he said after a pause, studying her intently. "I don't know your name, but they told me you were my anesthesiologist. You saved my life." "Thank you." "That's my job," Melissa said with a faint smile. "I'm glad you're all right." "But it wasn't me who saved you, it was the on-call surgeon, Raymond Burton." "Well, you were in charge, weren't you?" he said, his voice soft but resolute. "I don't know why, but I feel like fate sent you to me." With that, Jeffrey closed his eyes, visibly exhausted. Melissa felt her heart begin to race. She also debated whether to tell him about his doppelganger, the homeless man from the street. What if she was wrong? The man had stubble, after all, and it was easy to mistake someone in such a state. But deep down, Melissa knew the likelihood of a mistake was slim. Ever since her medical school days, she had prided herself on her photographic memory, remembering every patient she had ever treated. In some cases, years had passed, yet she still recognized faces. Here, only a few hours had elapsed. Melissa winced and decided against bringing up the uncanny resemblance for now. Another time, she thought. Too much has already happened today. She was exhausted, disoriented, but somewhere deep within, Jeffrey's words stirred something in her. "I have to go," Melissa murmured, feeling her cheeks flush. "And you need to recover after the surgery." "Please, wait," Jeffrey said, extending a hand. "Give me your phone number. I'd like to contact you once I'm better." Melissa hesitated, visibly flustered. But then, as if guided by an internal impulse, she scribbled her number on a piece of paper and handed it to Jeffrey. "Thank you," he said with a warm smile. Melissa left the ICU feeling as though her head was spinning. The day had been an unbroken chain of strange and unpredictable events. First, the court hearing, the divorce, the betrayal, and then the homeless man who turned out to be a businessman and a patient saved on the operating table. Walking down the corridor, Melissa felt both drained and uplifted by her professional accomplishments. Her gaze lingered briefly on her reflection in the window. The face staring back at her was worn, her eyes reddened, yet there was a new spark in them, a resilience she hadn't noticed before. Melissa gave herself a tired smile. Despite all the challenges, she realized she could overcome anything. Perhaps, she thought, she might even receive not just the burdens but some benefits from the division of their shared assets. To her surprise, Edward hadn't called her since the court ruling, though he had repeatedly tried to intimidate her over the phone before. Realistically, they could have split the clinic into two smaller branches or sold the business, dividing the proceeds evenly. There was also a third option. One of them would keep the business while compensating the other with half its value. Melissa would have been satisfied with any of these outcomes as long as it was fair and lawful. But Edward had always tried to tilt things in his favor. "I'll definitely need to consult a lawyer," Melissa thought as she decided to lie down on the couch in her office. "I can't handle this alone in court." Sleep claimed her almost immediately, a testament to the exhaustion that had accumulated over the day. Lately, she had often stayed on night shifts. The rented apartment she now called home felt cold and unfamiliar, and the house she had shared with Edward was now occupied by Evelyn and her son, born out of wedlock. Melissa bore no grudge about that. They had found each other, so be it. Let them live in happiness. She would manage on her own. Her beloved work and her cherished clinic were enough to fill the void. The medical staff appreciated Melissa's presence during night shifts. Somehow, when she was on duty, things often remained calm and uneventful. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the city blanketed in a pristine, fluffy white layer. The frost had grown sharper, lazily etching intricate patterns on the windows. Inside her office, the electric fireplace, set to half power, kept the room comfortably warm. But Melissa's reprieve was short-lived. Through the haze of sleep, she heard the insistent ringing of her phone. Struggling to open her eyes, she groped for it. It was Susan. "Melissa, we're in trouble. The police are here. There's a raid." Melissa's breath caught in her throat. "What police?" "Susan, what happened, and why is the police involved?" Her voice trembled. "I don't know," the nurse blurted out. "They say the head of the department received an anonymous tip about stolen medications. Everything's in chaos, and you've been called to the chief's office." As if in a dream, Melissa threw on her uniform coat and trudged downstairs. The lobby buzzed with noise and commotion. Men in uniform bustled back and forth, conversing and rifling through cabinets. Sitting on a chair by the door was the head nurse, her face pale and her eyes filled with terror. Alice Lane stared at her as though she'd seen a ghost. By the chief physician's office stood a bewildered Susan, flanked by two police officers. "Can I come in?" Melissa hesitantly stepped toward the door, and they let her through. In the office, a man in uniform with a major's insignia sat behind the desk. He looked up from his papers and fixed his gaze on Melissa. "Melissa Stanley?" he asked, polite but firm. "Yes, that's me." "What's going on?" She tried to keep her voice steady. "We received an anonymous report about stolen medications from your clinic." The major pushed the papers aside and met her eyes directly. "We're conducting an inspection." Melissa felt a chill run through her. Something was very wrong. "What stolen medications?" "There must be some mistake," she protested. "Nothing like that has happened here. It's absurd, just slander." "We hope it's a mistake too," the major replied honestly, but without making any promises. "However, we have to check. You'll need to be present during the storage inspection." Struggling to maintain her composure, Melissa left the office and followed the police officers. All the way to the storage room, she tried to convince herself it was just a bad dream. This couldn't be happening. The medicine storage room was a small space, its slightly ajar steel door already unnerving. When they opened it, Melissa felt goosebumps spread across her skin. "Are you in charge of this area?" one of the men asked. "Yes, that's correct," Melissa managed to say, her voice strained. "I'm responsible for inventory and storage." The officers began a meticulous inspection. They opened every cabinet and drawer, counting boxes and packages. Melissa watched them work, her sense of panic mounting. An anonymous tip? Stolen medications? Is this some kind of joke? Finally, a young lieutenant stepped back, his voice tinged with an unpleasant note. "Brandon, there's a problem. A shortage has been identified in the accountable group." "It can't be!" Melissa exclaimed. This is a mistake. The major approached the shelves, double-checking the inventory log before counting the packages once more. Disappointment spread across his face. Melissa, Brandon looked at her with undisguised disapproval. The shortage is quite significant, and that's already grounds for an investigation. I didn't do this. Melissa protested in panic. I don't even understand how this could have happened. That's exactly what we need to find out, the major replied coldly. But for now, we are forced to detain you until the circumstances are clarified. Melissa felt her legs give way as everything swam before her eyes. Arrest me? Me? These words didn't make sense in her head. This couldn't be real, it was like a nightmare. But the heavy footsteps of the approaching officer felt far too real to be a dream. We need to question you, the major said. But not here, at the station. This is a mistake, Melissa whispered as she was led down the corridor. In the lobby, the clinic's colleagues exchanged sympathetic glances, knowing that for Melissa, it was probably all over. Melissa got into the police car, and the world around her seemed to fall into darkness. The small holding cell was cold and uncomfortable. The only source of light was a dim bulb on the ceiling. Melissa let out a moan as she sank onto the hard bench and closed her eyes. She couldn't comprehend how this could have happened. Could they have set me up? She whispered into the empty space. But who could have done this and why? Fragments of memories flashed in her mind. Edward's smirk, Evelyn's poisonous gaze, Jeffrey's hopeful eyes. But the wealthy businessman she had saved definitely couldn't have had anything to do with this. This is a nightmare, Melissa whispered again. I need to wake up. But time passed, and the nightmare didn't end. She was a prisoner, an accused, a criminal, and it was all happening to her right here, right now. After 2 or 3 hours, when she had lost track of time, the door to the cell opened, and a police officer appeared in the doorway. You're being called for questioning, he said. Please follow me. Melissa stood up and followed him. In the interrogation room, the same major awaited her. Another officer sat at the table with a notepad and pen. So, Melissa, the major began, looking at her with open interest, what can you tell us about the shortage? I've already told you, I have nothing to do with this, Melissa replied tiredly. And I don't understand how this could have happened. I've always kept strict records. Could someone have done this on purpose? On purpose? The major asked, raising an eyebrow. And who, in your opinion, could have done this? Be specific, names, surnames? I don't know, Melissa answered honestly. I don't really have any enemies. And what about your husband? The officer stared at her intently. Melissa felt a sharp twist in her chest. You do have a joint business, right? And that, you know, is a conflict of interest. Edward? Well, I don't know, Melissa stammered. We're getting divorced. He doesn't like me much, but not to that extent. Your husband might very well be involved, the major continued. He's expressed his dissatisfaction with the property division before. Your clinic is quite profitable, after all. But what does that have to do with stolen medications? Melissa retorted. It doesn't make sense. I'm not insane enough to steal from myself. That's what we're going to find out, the major said, leaning back in his chair. We need more information. Tell us about your work schedule over the last few days, up until this morning. Melissa began to recount her work in detail, the clinic, the patients, the surgery on businessman Jeffrey Ford, and how she noticed a strange coincidence. The businessman looked very much like a homeless man she had seen on the day of her divorce. The major listened attentively, not interrupting. His face remained impassive. When Melissa finished her account, he asked a few more clarifying questions, carefully writing down every word she said. All right, the major said when the interrogation ended, we'll check the information, but for now, you'll remain in custody. In fact, part of this is in your best interest. Melissa's hands dropped in defeat. She felt helpless, like a puppet being pulled by strings. The cell was once again filled with silence and dim light. She lay down on the bench and stared at the ceiling. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she seemed not to notice them. Everything that had been important in her life was falling apart before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do about it. "No, I won't give up," she whispered. "I will prove my innocence. I will find out who set me up, no matter the cost." Of course, Melissa understood that Edward had a motive, but was he really so cynical and cruel as to harm his still lawful wife in such a heartless way? Well, there's a court, after all, and they'll decide how the property division should go. No matter how much she thought about it, she couldn't find a definitive candidate for the role of the traitor. All the doctors had worked at her clinic for years, and the nurses and orderlies weren't newcomers either. They had solid experience behind them. Take Susan, for instance. Before meeting Melissa, Susan had worked in a psychiatric and neurological dispensary. Quite a tough job. Not everyone could handle it. You needed to have strong nerves. But Susan turned out to be weak and soon broke down emotionally. To make matters worse, her fiancé left her for another woman, making a public spectacle of it, as if forgetting that just 3 weeks earlier they had filed for marriage registration. At that point, even though Susan was a healthcare worker herself, she sank into such a deep depression that she couldn't work anymore and eventually quit. There was no one to help her. Her father was an alcoholic, and her mother had left when she was young. She tried turning to various magicians and psychics, but it was all in vain. All they did was tear her soul apart with their conversations and deplete her savings. It's hard to imagine what would have happened to Susan if Melissa hadn't met her in the subway just in time. They bumped into each other by chance near the underground passage. Melissa was holding a houseplant she had bought from an old lady on the street. She almost dropped it, but Susan managed to catch it. That's how they met. Melissa somehow sensed that the girl needed help. On a subconscious level, perhaps, or in some other way, but from that moment on, Susan started working at the reception desk in her clinic. So, when it came to arresting Melissa, it was certainly not in Susan's interest. The only person Susan didn't get along with was the head nurse, Alice, who was older than her, had been married twice, and was cynical to the core, having seen it all. It was said that Alice had come from a neighboring town, where she had worked at the local hospital. However, no one really knew why she had left. Some said it was because she couldn't get along with the management, while others blamed her negligence, which led to some unpleasant consequences. In principle, Alice was the kind of person who could do anything to achieve her goals. But what motive did she have? How had Melissa wronged her when she had given her the head nurse position without any checks or probation? In any case, the pool of suspects was small. The medications had gone missing from the storage exactly on the night of Alice's shift, and in the department, besides Melissa and a few orderlies, there were only Susan and Alice. Naturally, they were the ones with access to the storage and the key to the door. Of course, Edward could easily have recruited one of the employees, promising a cushy job after getting rid of his wife, but on the other hand, Melissa had known her husband for 7 years and had never noticed any outright malice in him. At least not the kind that would involve false accusations through forgery. Time dragged on endlessly. Am I really going to have to spend the night here? Melissa thought with sorrow. How embarrassing. At least my parents don't know yet. They think it's just about the divorce. The evening sky had turned a deep crimson when she was finally released. Without saying a word, the officer led her outside, handing her a document to sign. Melissa stepped out and squinted at the bright streetlight. The cold air burned her face, but she still couldn't believe she was free. The sense of injustice weighed heavily on her. The accusation of theft, the arrest, all of this after such a difficult and emotionally taxing day. At that moment, a man in a sharp coat approached her and introduced himself as her lawyer. Melissa Stanley? My name is Michael Williams. You've been released on a personal recognizance bond. But how is that possible? She asked. Jeffrey Ford personally vouched for you, the lawyer explained with a slight smile. The very same patient who had surgery at your clinic yesterday. Melissa flinched. The businessman, the one who looked so much like the homeless man. She couldn't believe what was happening. A person she had seen only a few hours ago in the operating room and the ICU had vouched for her. Jeffrey couldn't have stayed out of this, Michael continued. He said, "You're a doctor by divine right, and you can't be guilty of anything like this." He paused, then added, "He also asked me to accompany you home." The entire ride, Melissa sat in silence, trying to process all the overwhelming information. When they finally arrived, Michael stopped the car and said in a low voice, "I'll need to contact you soon, but for now, I advise you to rest." Melissa nodded and got out of the car. Her heart ached with unease. She felt a hidden threat, but where was it coming from? Who was behind it? Approaching the door of her rented apartment, Melissa froze. In bright red spray paint, someone had written, "Thief lives here." In a moment of helplessness, she punched the doorframe and quietly began to cry. What else could she do? Scrub the paint off? But with what? She probably needed a special mixture, and where would she find that at this hour? After a moment, Melissa composed herself enough to unlock the door and step inside. Her apartment, which had once felt cozy and safe, now seemed only to amplify her anxiety and fear. She collapsed onto the couch and buried her face in her hands. It felt terrifying, lonely, and deeply unfair. She couldn't understand why all of this was happening to her, especially now. She had always worked honestly, but someone clearly wanted to tarnish her reputation. After some time, Melissa got up and turned on the light. She scanned the room. One thought spun endlessly in her mind. Who had done this? Could it really be Edward again? No, she couldn't bring herself to believe it. She could accuse him of many things, but not of this. There was clearly something else at play here. But who could a doctor possibly cross, especially one working in such a narrow, specialized field as anesthesiology? She hadn't said a bad word about anyone in the clinic in all her years there, and she'd never hurt any of her subordinates. Or had she missed something? Who could have framed her? Could it have been the head nurse? Shaking her head, Melissa trudged to the bathroom. After hours spent behind bars, all she wanted was a long bath to clear her mind. And there was still the matter of the homeless man that haunted her thoughts. How had he even appeared at the clinic? The whole thing felt repulsive, as though she had been thrown into a pit of filth. Turning on the tap, she filled the bathtub and, with a sigh of relief, sank into the warm water. Images swirled in her head like a broken record: Edward, Evelyn, and herself, deceived and humiliated. The hot water helped her relax a little. After half an hour, Melissa got out of the bath, wrapped herself in a soft robe, and went to bed. But sleep eluded her. The events of the day kept replaying in her mind until, finally, dreams took over. She was back at the clinic, but something was off. It felt strange, almost like a celebration. Everyone was smiling, but the smiles were cruel and fake. Suddenly, with startling clarity, she saw Alice with a displeased expression, whispering something to Susan at the reception desk. Without warning, the head nurse turned and spoke in a voice full of sorrow. "Well, what do you know, silly girl? Caught, huh?" Melissa tried to protest, but she couldn't speak. It was as if something was lodged in her throat. Then, everything vanished, leaving her in complete darkness. She awoke in a cold sweat, her heart racing, and Alice's ominous voice still echoed in her mind. After struggling to finish a cup of coffee, Melissa hurried to the clinic, a sense of unease gnawing at her that she couldn't explain. Entering the reception area, she spotted Susan, who seemed completely out of sorts. Her face was pale, and she nervously fiddled with the edge of her coat. "Susan, is something wrong?" Melissa asked, trying to sound calm. Susan lifted her tearful eyes and whispered, "Melissa, I'm sorry, but I don't know what to do." At that moment, Alice entered the hallway. She looked at Melissa with a serious expression and quietly said, "Susan, should I tell her, or can you handle it yourself?" Saying this, Alice handed Susan her phone. With trembling hands, Susan showed Melissa a photograph. It depicted a moment when Susan was in the storage room, moving boxes onto a cart. The photo was taken in the clinic's corridor, just before the theft. What is this? Melissa whispered. This is proof of her guilt, the head nurse said sadly. Susan sniffled and, looking at her boss with tear-filled eyes, stammered. Melissa, I'm sorry, but I was forced to. It's all Evelyn, Edward's mistress, she's my half-sister. Melissa almost lost her breath from shock. This was a complete turn of events. But why had Susan kept this a secret? She was at a loss. How did all this connect? And why would Evelyn frame her? But what does the theft of medications have to do with it? Melissa asked, struggling to keep her emotions in check. She said it's for the court, so Edward can take full control of the clinic. After they convict you, of course, Susan replied. To be honest, I didn't know it was this serious. And how is Evelyn holding this over you? Is she blackmailing you? You didn't frame me of your own accord, did you? Questions kept tumbling out of Melissa. Susan choked on her tears. Evelyn holds it over me because of a child. Actually, her Donald is my son. She couldn't have children after her miscarriage, and I happened to be pregnant by my fiancé, the one who left me. So, Evelyn convinced Edward that the child was his, just so everything would revolve around her, and you've always been an obstacle for them. Melissa's mind spun. The pieces of confusion finally started to fall into place. It seemed that Evelyn had wanted to eliminate her, take control of the clinic, and, most importantly, keep Edward by manipulating her half-sister's child. Melissa, I know you're not guilty, Susan sobbed. Please forgive me, I really didn't want this to happen. Tears rolled down the cheeks of the young nurse, and Melissa felt her heart tighten with a painful spasm. Don't cry, she said, hugging the girl, we'll fix everything. Really? Susan asked, looking up through her tears. Because Evelyn says she'll take away my parental rights. I hardly ever see my son as it is. Melissa looked into Alice's eyes and asked, Tell me, Alice, did you know about Evelyn's plans? The head nurse lowered her gaze but didn't answer. Why are you silent? Melissa raised her voice. You knew, didn't you? Was that it? Unable to withstand her boss's gaze, Alice quietly spoke. Yes, I knew. She promised me the position of head of the clinic after you left. Susan couldn't manage it on her own, but together, we were almost invincible. Melissa, still in disbelief, stared silently at the pair. Alice, then why did you decide to tell the truth? She asked directly. The head nurse lowered her eyes, ashamed. Honestly, my conscience tortured me. You treated me with all your heart, and I repaid you like this. So I decided to film Susan. Just in case she opposed telling you the truth. Tears welled up in the corners of Melissa's eyes. Could such treachery really exist? Could she have suspected betrayal from two nurses, covering for each other? Such a thing could only happen in a nightmare. And it was the nightmare I had on the night before Friday, Melissa thought briefly. Well, now I don't know what to believe anymore. After dealing with her subordinates, Melissa handed them the police major's phone number and went on her rounds. Not as an anesthesiologist, of course, but as the co-owner of the clinic. The last person she visited was businessman Jeffrey Ford, who, as it turned out, had been eagerly waiting for her, accompanied by his lawyer. After conducting a post-operative examination, she told the patient everything, leaving out no details. She spoke about Evelyn's treachery, Alice and Susan's betrayal, and the deceit she had fallen victim to. She also told him about the businessman's double she had seen near the courthouse. When Melissa finished her account, a tense silence hung in the room. Then Jeffrey turned to his lawyer. Michael, take care of this case. I want everyone responsible to be held accountable. Of course, the lawyer replied readily. Melissa looked at Jeffrey with gratitude. It felt unusual to her that a stranger had trusted her so openly and without hesitation. Thank you, Jeffrey, she whispered. I don't even know how to thank you. No need, he smiled. Just be yourself. You're an amazing doctor. And about your resemblance to the homeless man, Melissa began, you never explained that. Well, you see, the young businessman said awkwardly, sometimes, in order to see the truth, you need to hit rock bottom. Stephen is my twin brother. We used to be inseparable until he started drinking and gambling. Our father didn't like it, so he gave him an ultimatum, the family business or the alcohol. And Stephen chose the latter? Melissa guessed. Yes, that's right, Jeffrey nodded sadly. Alcohol, bars, and women were always closer to him than boring office life. My father was really worried about him. He tried everything to cure him of alcoholism. Sent him to rehab centers, but it was all in vain. Then Stephen got into a terrible car accident and spent 3 years in a coma. He had 7 surgeries, including a craniotomy, and when he woke up, he was a different person. Stephen has a condition, you understand? He experiences memory lapses every minute and can't remember anything. Essentially, my brother lives the same day over and over again. He doesn't recognize me, our parents, anyone. It's like he's in a blissful state. So why don't you take him in? Why does he wander the streets? Melissa asked in surprise. Jeffrey forced a smile. My brother isn't a homeless man, although he sometimes begs for money, but not for himself, it's for the street animals. In fact, he is constantly followed by 2 personal bodyguards. They protect Stephen from danger and help him find a place to stay. Why did he choose to live like a vagabond? I don't know. At home, he feels restricted, often isolates himself, cries. But outside, it's like he comes alive. He feeds the pigeons and homeless dogs in the park, sometimes plays with the kids in the playground. The little ones adore him, he's like a nanny to them. But no one realizes that Stephen isn't a homeless man at all, and every evening, he's taken home in a limousine. Wow! I thought it was just a coincidence, people looking alike, Melissa whispered. Deep down, she was shocked by this revelation, for she couldn't have imagined how everything would turn out for her. After the conversation with the patient, Melissa realized that life wasn't just pain but also the hope for justice, love, and, in the end, happiness. She was now ready to fight to the end for her clinic and for the truth. That same day, Evelyn was declared wanted. Edward, upon learning the truth, immediately tried to talk to Melissa, but she refused to listen. She wasn't the weak, helpless woman he had once known and used for his own goals. Melissa decided not to fire Susan and Alice but gave them a chance to make amends. Especially since Susan had finally managed to get her son back, who her sister had passed off as her own for years. In turn, after meeting little Donald, Melissa bought him a huge building set and a whole dozen toy cars. But what impressed her most was her meeting with Stephen. She had never met a kinder man in her life. The homeless man loved animals dearly and beamed like a child when a dog touched his hands with a wet nose in return for his help. The children also adored him, respectfully calling him Uncle Stephen. After thinking for a moment, Melissa decided to give him a special gift, but first, she had to visit the animal shelter. When Stephen saw the puppy, he couldn't hold back his tears. What if tomorrow I forget his name?" the man asked, childishly naive. Melissa looked at the lawyer with concern, and he immediately found a solution. "We'll put a collar on him with a tag, and on the tag will be his name." A sweet smile crossed Stephen's face, so sincere and warm that Melissa couldn't hold back her tears. "Can I play with the puppy?" asked Donald. "Of course, you can," Stephen replied readily. "Play as much as you want. It will be good for the little one. Maybe, over time, he'll even learn to shake paws." "Of course, he'll learn," Donald said happily, agreeing enthusiastically. The time until the next court session flew by in a haze. Melissa, immersed in the whirlwind of events, threw herself into her work. Michael turned out to be not only a professional in his field but also a loyal friend. Helping Melissa navigate the legal intricacies and gathering evidence for the new trial, he felt that he was doing something good and right. It happened that, up until the very day of the trial, Melissa hadn't seen Jeffrey. She was therefore struck by how much the man had changed. After the surgery, he seemed completely different, as though he had truly been reborn. His eyes burned with firmness and confidence, yet they also conveyed care and empathy. "Everything will be fine, Melissa. I believe in you," the businessman said calmly, and his words gave her strength. The courtroom was filled with a tense atmosphere. Edward, with his arrogant and self-assured demeanor, was still hoping to take the clinic and all that had been accumulated during their marriage. Taking her seat, Melissa took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Soon, the lawyers from both sides sat down, and the proceedings began. Michael, like a skilled conductor, presented the gathered evidence clearly and persuasively. He spoke about embezzlement, forgery of documents, the involvement of Susan and Alice, and the manipulations carried out by Edward's mistress. The lawyer consistently supported his words with witness testimonies, step by step unraveling the entire dirty scheme. In this way, he effectively shattered the arguments of the opposing side. Several times, Melissa caught Jeffrey's gaze. She felt his support, and it gave her confidence. She spoke clearly, calmly describing the shared business and recounting both the challenges and successes. "I have invested not only my time, effort, and knowledge in this clinic, but also my soul, and I believe it rightfully belongs to me," Melissa concluded, looking directly into the judge's eyes. A silence fell. Each second felt like an eternity. She stood frozen, waiting for the verdict, feeling her heart pound in her chest. The court rules in favor of Melissa Stanley's claim in full. The clinic remains her sole property. The house and other real estate are to be divided equally. The judge's words left Edward in shock. He had lost the most important thing, his business, which he had built brick by brick with his wife's hard work. Evelyn did not hide for long and was arrested just a few days after being placed on the wanted list. But by then, Melissa was no longer concerned about her. She stepped outside, and Jeffrey tactfully led her aside. "I'm so happy for you," he said, and his voice was filled with sincerity and warmth. "You're strong, brave, and you deserve happiness." "Thank you, but I wouldn't have made it without you," Melissa replied, gazing at him with gratitude in her eyes. "That's not all I wanted to say." The businessman paused, took a deep breath, and then spoke. "Melissa, I want this victory to be just the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. I fell in love with you at first sight, and I would like to share my whole life with you. Will you marry me?" She was taken aback. She hadn't expected words like these today. Melissa looked into his eyes, filled with love, and saw not just a passionate lover, but also a reliable friend, someone who was ready to support her in everything. "Yes, I agree," she whispered. Jeffrey took her hands in his and gently kissed them. A month later, they were married in a beautiful ceremony, publicly exchanging vows of love and loyalty. In that moment, Melissa understood that she had found her true happiness because the man beside her loved her for who she was and accepted her with all her virtues and flaws. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.